All right, let's get started. Thank you for joining us today on the 13th of October. Today, our 12th episode of the WMUG Tuesdays webinar. Today with Thijs Lecomte from Belgium, and he's going to have a session about managing enterprise applications in Azure AD. But before I hand over to Thijs, let's first thank our sponsors. In normal life, we would be able to organize on-premises events. Unfortunately, it's still not going to happen, and most likely we won't make it this year because later today our government will have some new rules we need to comply. So thanks for our sponsors, and hopefully we can organize on-premises sessions next year again, so we can meet in person. Us on social media. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We need 100 people to follow us to allow us to change the name of the channel, so we don't have UCX minus something. So subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we can make it even more user-friendly. If you have a session you want to present in this Tech Tuesdays webinar, go to this URL and submit your session. It's always we're always welcoming people to share their knowledge, share their technical experience. So don't be shy, like Thijs did. Submit your session, and you might be one of the next presenters. Coming up is the next webinar is in 2 weeks with our own Eric and Kenneth, and it will be some kind of a follow-up of this session. So make sure to listen carefully today. But now I want to hand it over to Thijs. Thijs, thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you, Peter. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to present here.
You're very welcome.
If everything is fine, you guys should see my screen at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So let's. So managing enterprise applications in Azure AD is the topic for my talk. It's something I do not think all organizations know what to do and why they should do it. So the goal of this session is at the end of the session, you should know what to do around enterprise applications and Azure AD. First off, like Peter already mentioned, this wouldn't be possible without our sponsors, of course. Then let's start off with a small introduction of myself. So like Peter said, I am Thijs Lecomte. I am from Belgium. Currently, I am working as a senior Microsoft 365 consultant for the Collective Consulting. Here I'm focusing on the Microsoft 365 stack with a main focus on identity security, automation, and endpoint management through Intune. Next to my day job, I'm also the technical editor for the Microsoft 365 Security for the IT Pro ebook, which is an ebook and covers the wide aspect of Microsoft 365 security, where we provide monthly updates, so you guys are up to date with all the latest information. Peter is actually one of the authors of this book and has written and is maintaining the Intune and Identity chapter. If you want to follow me on social media, I am available through Twitter and through LinkedIn. I'm also active on my blog 365.days, where you can find more about security, endpoint management, and automation. And if you want to learn more about the book, you can visit our website, m365securitybook.com. So now let's get into it. So what will we cover today? Like I told you before, we're going to talk about enterprise applications. I want to start off with a small introduction of everything. What is an enterprise applications? What are app registrations? So you guys know what you're working with. After this, I will touch on the danger. Okay, an enterprise application is awesome. We'll see that. but what can the dangers be of this? Then we will talk about mitigation. We know what the danger is. Okay, how can we solve this danger? There are a few different solutions. We will go over each one of them. And last but not least, we'll talk about monitoring with two Microsoft security products, which are Cloud Security and Azure Sentinel. We'll discuss how you can monitor enterprise applications within your environment. So first, let's start off with some terminology. You guys might have heard of both app registrations and enterprise applications. They're actually dependent of each other. So an app registration is actually the definition of an application. So here you configure what the application should authenticate to, what kind of permissions he can have, what URL should he be using, all these things. So this is the definition of an application. Then we have an enterprise application, which is actually an instance of an application. An enterprise application always refers back to an app registration. So you cannot have an enterprise application without having an app registration. This was possible in the past, but Microsoft has done some changes. So you always have an enterprise registration when you're talking about an enterprise application. But there's actually a one-to-many relationship, which means one app registration can have one or more enterprise applications. We'll see some example in just a minute to really show you guys what this is and how they behave with each other. So to recap a bit, an app registration is a definition of an application. Here we can configure, okay, what kind of permission should these applications have? If the user is authenticated to Azure AD, how should it be redirected to our application? And all these kind of things. So it's really important that you configure this right so your application can use Azure AD integration. And then enterprise applications as the instance of an application. Like I said, it always refers to one app registration. And for one app registration, there can be multiple enterprise applications. Important to know is the term service principal is often used to depict the same thing as an enterprise application. Within Azure AD, you will find mostly the term enterprise application, but in some things like logging and log files, you can still see service principals. So it's important to know that these things are the same. You might not know it, but you're using enterprise applications every day, because for an application to authenticate to Azure AD, you actually always have to authenticate to an application, which means if you're logging into Office 365, there's actually an enterprise application in the background from Microsoft, which does this authentication. Now, we know what they are, but how do we use them and how do we create them? Well, before we jump into the portal, an app registration is mostly when you're trying to make an integration with Microsoft 365 or Azure. For example, you need a script which reads out all the mail of all your users inside of the company. For that, you need the Graph API. And in order to use the Graph API, you need to create your own app registration. Creating an app registration can be done through the portal by an IT admin or an end user. And you can also use PowerShell or an API to create those app registrations. Important to know, the moment you create an app registration, automatically an enterprise application is also made in the background. So as you can see, they are really heavily connected. So one way to create an enterprise application is to create an app registration. But there are also some different options. For example, some third-party applications, for example, Salesforce, actually use Azure AD authentication, and they have an app registration in their own tenant. When a user logs into Salesforce, an enterprise application will actually be made in your own tenant. Important to know, when you're logging into an enterprise application, this application doesn't have the permission per se, not from the start. You have to accept these permissions. And this is where you consent. So consenting is actually saying, I accept those permissions. a bit like the same on your mobile phone, where you have to accept that an app uses your camera. Here you have to accept that an application uses certain permissions. We have two kinds, admin consent and user consent. By user consent, it's only one user who's giving access to its own data. Admin consent is the administrator giving access to the data of the entire organization. We touched on the enterprise application and the multi-tenant scenario, where, for example, we have Salesforce. So as you well know, Salesforce is a software as a service application, which can use Azure AD integration. To facilitate, the administrator and the Salesforce Azure AD tenant has to create an app registration. As I said, for every app registration that is made, an enterprise application is made in the background. Now, when a user from your own company, here I depict this with Contoso and Fabricam, try to use this app registration from Salesforce, which means they're trying to log into Salesforce, it will create an enterprise application within your own tenant. And these enterprise applications always refer back to the same app registration. This is again the one-to-many scenario. So we have, in this case, 3 different enterprise applications which refer to the same app registration and the tenant of Salesforce. Now, these are a lot of definitions and might not be so clear. So that's why I want to go through the portal right now and show you how to configure these and what the differences are. So if we go to portal.azure.com, we can go to our Azure Active Directory admin page. As you can see here, we have 2 options. We have app registrations and enterprise applications. Let's start off with app registrations. So this is when you want to create your own integration within Azure AD or Microsoft 365. I have a few here. These are the ones I have created, and these are the ones some of my colleagues have created in this test tenant. You can see this is a mess. This is not how it's supposed to be done. Use meaningful names. Don't be like me and use test for like 6 different things. But here at the top, we can click new registration, which means we can create a app registration. Now for the name, it's important to choose a good name, because if users are actually logging into this application, they will see this name. Then inside of the account types, we can see a few different things. What do you have to choose here? Well, it depends on the application you're trying to build. In our scenario, to just read out all the mails of our users, we can click single tenant. But for example, an application like Salesforce would actually be using multi-tenant. And then here at the bottom, we have redirect URI. This actually means, okay, for Salesforce, the user clicks on the login button in Salesforce. He's being redirected to Azure AD. He logs in Azure AD. But after the login is complete, where should the user go? So in this case, it could be something like Salesforce. If I can type correctly, salesforce.com/OAuth/redirect. Just to give you an example. So now we can register this application, and you can see it's almost instantaneous. You can see here the display name and also the client ID and tenant ID, which need to be used if you're trying to authenticate. Now, here are the 2 most important things in an app registration for us. This is the authentication bit. Here we can see the redirect URI we created in the beginning, but you can also create your own and, for example, add a different platform if you're trying to use an Android application or an iOS application. Where it gets dangerous and interesting is in API permissions. Here we can configure what kind of permissions this application needs to have. In our case, if we want to read out the mailboxes of user, we should click on Add Permission, Microsoft Graph, and then if we click Mail, we will see Mail, okay, Mail user read. which is perfect. We want to read the user's mailbox. Now, as you can see, I have added these permissions, and when the user would now log into our application, they would have to consent. They would have to agree to those permissions. If you do not want to provide this pop-up to the user, you can grant admin consent. And like before, if you grant admin consent, all the this permission will be accepted for every user and your own tenant. So this is about the app registration. Like I said, when we create an app registration, it also creates an enterprise application in the background. We can see this if we go to Overview. On the right, we see Managed Application and Local Directory. If we click here, we are actually referred to back to the enterprise application. So this is one way of going to the enterprise applications. There are a few other ways. If you go back to Azure AD, go to enterprise applications, scroll to the bottom, we can see here our test application. What can we see here? A few different things. The most important parts in our case is the users and groups. This means which users is currently using this application and what kind of permissions does this application have. Really easy to use. If you click sign in, you can actually see which users are logging into this application. For us, this is nobody because I just created this application, but we can look at another example. I want to show you an example of, I think almost everybody will have this enterprise application in his tenant. This is actually Apple Internet Accounts. This is an enterprise application which is used by the iOS Mail app, so the native mail app on iPad or iPhone, which is used to read out the mail of the users. Here we can see a few good examples, which is in user and groups, we can see, okay, who is using this application? This is only me. I have consented those permissions. And okay, what permissions does this application have? This is really important to monitor because you need to be able to make sure that you know which kind of third-party applications have access to your permissions. Because if we look at this here, this would mean if Apple ever would get breached, which I doubt will happen, but if they do, this attacker could check all the mail of the users who are using the Apple Internet Accounts application. Like I told you before, if we click on sign-ins, we can actually see the sign-ins happening to this application. This is really easy to troubleshoot if you're having struggles with a certain application. You can go to the application and click on sign-ins. Now this is an application that's recreated or it was automatically created. We can also create our own if you want. If you click on Enterprise Application, we will create our own enterprise application. And this means an app registration for this already exists in another tenant. We just link the two together, if you can say so. For example, we can link it to Atlassian, which is used for Jira. If we add this will create an enterprise application. And then we have to link this enterprise application within our Jira instance, which would enable users to log into our Jira instance using their Azure AD credentials, which is really advised, of course. So if we click Add, it will take a while. Okay, and it doesn't want to go. I have added this one before, so let's try another one. Let's try Google, for example. If we add this one, this should be added in a little bit. And it's loading. In the meantime, I will show you. So enterprise application types are the ones that you have created. If you go to Microsoft applications, you will see a whole bunch of applications. So these are the ones that you use when you're logging into the backend infrastructure of Azure. For example, if you're logging into the Azure portal, like I am, you actually use the Azure portal service principal. We can see this by going to sign-ins. You can actually see which users are logging into the Azure portal for this tenant. Now, so enterprise applications and app registrations can be used to create integrations. which is really awesome. And this is, in my opinion, also the power of the cloud and of Azure AD. You enable the user to choose its own applications. If a user wants to use a third-party applications to improve his productivity, in my opinion, you should try to facilitate this. But there are still a few dangers involved in this one. The first one I want to touch upon is something that might not be often ignored, in my opinion, and this is the insider threat. What do I mean by that? I welcome everybody right now to go to their app registrations and look into every app registration that has been made. You need to make sure that for app registrations, you always use least privileges, which means you only add the permissions to the application that the application needs. I have seen applications and customer tenants which had every possible permission there was. The application just has to sign somebody in, but the developer was thinking, okay, it's not working, so let's add everything. But they added access to mail, access to SharePoint, access to OneDrive, access to Teams, Planner, just about everything. So it's really important that you educate your administrators and developers, okay, be careful what you're doing with these applications. Know when to use which permissions and be careful with the authentication that goes to this application. Because if an application would leak and those credentials would leak, this would become a huge danger. What I also told you is that an admin can accept permissions for the entire tenant, which is admin consent. Which admins can do admin consent? Well, 3 different ones: global admin, application admin, and cloud application admin. So these are actually high privileged roles which you should monitor. You should know, okay, who has those permissions and who is abusing those permissions. So it's really important to educate your fellow IT administrators. What is possibly the most dangerous threat is, of course, the external threat, and this is auth phishing attacks. These are phishing attacks who are using enterprise applications. What was a phishing attack in the past? You received an email which referred back to a malicious Microsoft login site, which was not legitimate. The user filled in his password and his username, and the attacker could then afterwards connect to the account and read out all the mail. But of course, I hope most organizations have implemented multi-factor authentication. Then with multi-factor authentication, that would not work anymore, those kind of phishing attacks. So what are the new phishing attacks? They're actually using enterprise applications. They send you to a link on a certain website. The user logs in. Maybe there's multi-factor authentication, but afterwards he is greeted with this screen. So the user actually has to give permissions, in this case, to the app O365 access and provide read access to your mail. You know, most of the end users, they would just click accept, they wouldn't care, and they would accept those permissions. The danger is you might be monitoring for sign-ins, but are you monitoring for service principals or enterprise applications who are logging in? You're probably not. And this is the real danger of this. We have seen a real uprise in these attacks in the last year or two, and Microsoft has actually warned heavily for this because the danger is so big, most people won't notice it. This is why I also invite you to monitoring enterprise applications and to check the current list. So we know what the danger is. We have the insider threat, rogue admins or admins who don't know what they're doing. And we also have external threats or auth phishing attacks. Now it's time to up our defenses and defend against this. What I want you to keep in mind is, okay, it's possible to just block the creation of enterprise applications, but this would mean an end user cannot use third-party applications. There are a lot of great third-party applications out there, which I think a user should be able to use. It's a modern world, we're in a new world, and users are choosing their own application. Should be able to facilitate this if possible, but you have to defend against attacks like the OAuth phishing attacks so that you know your data is safe. We have a couple of ways to defend against this. The first one is actually publisher verification. This means that somebody who is creating a new application will have to verify itself as a publisher. You can see the differences on the left and the right. So on the left, this person who has created this application, when he was creating this application, he didn't verify himself. On the right, we can see, okay, this organization has verified itself. Why is publisher verification a good thing? Well, two reasons. One of them is consent policies, which is something for the next slide. The other one is it's easy for you as an admin to know, okay, I can trust this application a little bit better because Microsoft has verified it. And you could train an end user to look for this verified sign and know, okay, if it's verified, you can trust the application a little bit more. But the big advantage of publisher verification is actually in controlling consent policies. So what is a consent policy? It actually means, can an end user consent to an enterprise application? Which means, can he give a permission to a third-party application to access his own data through a different application? So for example, in this OAuth phishing attack, this would mean that the third-party application would have access to its mail. You do not want this, of course. What you can also do with these consent policies is you can make sure, okay, if they can consent, to what permissions can they consent to? Which means you can create some low-level risk permissions that an end user can use so that he is free to choose what application he wants. But if there are some more permissions like reading a mailbox, this should be verified by an administrator. And this is what we're going to see next. First, it's actually pretty good. Microsoft released a blog post last week, about publisher verification. And this is the one. So what it's saying is that end users will no longer be able to consent to new multi-tenant apps after November 8th, which is actually next month. This makes verified publishers really important. And if you right now have a multi-tenant application out there, I really recommend you verify yourself as a verified publisher. So with consent policies, we can control which users can accept those permissions and what permissions they could have. Don't worry, I go in the portal in 2 minutes and I'll show you this. But two important things first. One of them is actually the admin workflow. If you have disabled user consent, this means a user cannot add applications himself anymore, which could be a hassle because then he has to send the link of the application to the help desk. The help desk has to verify this application, approve it, and then come back to the end user to say, okay, this is approved or not. Admin workflow actually automates this a bit, which means when an end user is greeted with an application he cannot add, he is asked to put a reason, then he can request this approval, and then an IT administrator can accept this application through the Azure portal. As you can see here, this is an example of such a request. We will go to the portal in a minute to show what these requests look like and how an end user should ask for this. But first, we'll talk about user assignment. You might have an application which is okay for some users to use, but not for all your users. It might be that this application is only reserved for your C-level executive, so your CEO, CFO, and nobody else for your organization needs to log into this application. With user consent, we can actually configure, with user assignment, we can configure which users can log into an application. So we have 4 different defenses. We have publisher verification, consent policies, admin workflow, and then user assignment. Now let's go through the portal and check each one of those. So first off, publisher verification. This is actually done through app registrations. If you go through your own app registration, for example, this is mine, the one I just created. Inside of branding, you have the option here for publisher verification. So here you have to enable and associate your Microsoft Partner Center account to this application, which means your application becomes verified, which needs to happen before November 8th. Otherwise, some users might not be able to use your application. Now, before we go over to consent policies, I want to reiterate that consent policies is for enterprise applications. By default, every user can create its own app registration. App registrations are mostly used for creating your own integration, and an end user doesn't really have to create an app registration to be productive. This is why I advise you to disable the user's ability to create an app registration, which is done through user settings. Here you can, this is default yes, users can register applications. I advise you to set this to no, so a user cannot create app registrations. Now this is for app registrations. We haven't protected our enterprise applications, which are used for the OAuth phishing attacks. Here we can go to enterprise applications. And here we have consent and permissions. Inside consent and permissions, we can see the user consent settings. So by default, both are gone to this option, which means every user can add applications that he wants, which means he could add an application that has access to his mail data. Again, these OAuth phishing attacks. This is something you do not want. This is why we have 2 different options. We could close the door entirely and not let a user add application. This would mean that every application needs to be added by an administrator. We can also select the second option, which is kind of the middle ground. What does it do? Well, a user can add applications if it's from a verified publisher. So verifying yourself as a verified publisher is really important. And he can only do this for permissions who are deemed low impact. What permissions are low impact? Well, we can configure this here in permission classifications. We will get to this in a little bit. So we have these 3 options. I always recommend to put it on this option and then configure your policies yourselves. For the purpose of a demo, I will do in a little bit. I will keep it on do not allow user consent. Then we also have group owner consent, which means the owner of a Microsoft 365 group, can he give access to his data? As you can see, there is no way to only allow this for verified applications or for certain permissions. So this is why I mostly keep this on do not allow group owner consent. So as I told you, it's recommended to go for the middle settings, which you can define low impact permissions. How can we define low impact permissions? Well, if we click here on permissions classifications, we can select permissions that are low impact. You might want to ask yourself, okay, in my organization, what is low impact? In my opinion, low impact is everything that has to do with the user being able to logging in to an application so that he can use a cloud application by itself without needing admin approval. If he wants to use another application, which, for example, uses mailbox permissions, this should be requested. So here I will check these permissions so that the user can log into application. Again, this is something you have to decide for yourself as an organization. I advise most organizations to keep their consent policies the same as the approval for desktop applications. what are the requirements for the user to receive a new desktop application. Try to expand this to cloud applications so that for a user, there's one clear way on how to request an application. So now we have controlled consent. We have configured, okay, a user can add these permissions or cannot add an application. Like I told you before, if he cannot add an application, an administrator has to do this. To make it easy for the administrator and the user, we can click on user settings. And here we can configure the admin workflow. This is the admin consent request here, the admin workflow. We can enable it here, which I advise you to do. Then we have to configure, okay, who should review the requests that are coming in from the end users. If an end user is requesting something, which admin should review it? You can pick between the lists. This list will only show, like it says here, global application or cloud application admins, because these are the only 3 roles who can grant a admin consent. We can click this away, and the next other options are actually to configure some email options that an admin will receive an email. So now, yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we have a question which you might be able to answer. It's from Steve, and he asks how dangerous the offline access permission is.
Yeah, it can be dangerous, of course, because then an application can download data. But I'm seeing that this permission is often used within third-party applications. For example, the Apple Internet account uses this offline permission to be able to make sure to cache the mails. So this is something you should check inside your organization. Can this be kept as permission, yes or no? But it could be a dangerous permission indeed, but a lot of applications are using it. So this is why I put it in the low risk, so a user can add most of the applications.
Great.
Steve, if there is another question, I'll get back to you after the demo. So let's see this thing in action. I will go to a well-known SaaS application, if I can type the name correctly, which is Calendly. This is just a SaaS application which integrates with your Office 365 calendar. If we click login here and I fill in the permissions for this account, I will be able to sign in with the application, with my user, I mean. Like this. And now we will see, okay, approval required. This user cannot just grant permissions to his own calendar. He has to have an admin review this. So in this case, you have to educate your end user to just to put a justification in this. For example, my manager wants me to do this, which is, in my opinion, a pretty lame message, but just an example. If we request approval, this will get sent back to Azure AD. So as of this moment, or in a few minutes, of course, an administrator would receive a message, okay, there is a new request for an application. If we go at the bottom in enterprise applications, we can go to admin consent requests, and we should be able to see the request for currently right here. So what can we see here? Okay, we can see what is this application, what is the home page. As an administrator, you could now go back to the website of this application and verify, is this something I want to give or not? If we click requested by, we can see, okay, this is the user who is requesting this information, and this is the justification for this. Now, as an administrator, you have 3 different options. You can accept the application, you can block it, which means it will be blocked entirely and won't be possible to use, also not in the future. And then deny will just deny the request, but a user can still request this again in the future. So for this example, we will do review permissions and consent. Then for this, we have to log in with our administrator account. And if we have logged in, we can see, okay, the Calendly application tries to go to the calendar of the user. This is the moment you as an admin have to know, okay, what is accepted in my organization. In my opinion, to know which application has to be approved is not the job of the IT. This is the job of management, who should decide which applications can have access to our data. So if we click now accept, and the background and enterprise application will be made for Calendly, and the permissions will be granted. If I click accept here, the permissions will be accepted for the entire tenant, and every user will be able to access this application. So let's try this out. If we click accept, then of course in the background right now is creating the enterprise application, which might take a while. So if I go to all applications, and if I'm lucky, I might be able to search for it here, but I'm probably a bit too fast. So let's check again. Normally it's within a few minutes, but this time it doesn't want to go. Okay, let's wait a few minutes for this. What I want to tell you is, okay, this admin consent workflow can be pretty great, but you might be asking yourself, okay, I do not want to receive an email for this. I would like to create a ticket in my service desk for this. Well, as of now, since the preview, this is not possible yet. There is, as far as I know, no API support for this, which means you cannot easily integrate it with your ServiceNow or your Jira Service Desk. So for now, you still have to use the portal and the email notifications, but in the future, Microsoft will be adding support to API so that you can receive those consents and create tickets in your servicing and your service desk, which can then be reviewed by an administrator. Now, if we go back to all applications, right now we can see, okay, Calendly has been added. What can we see here? We can see users and groups. This means, okay, who has consent to this application? So who has consented those permissions? This was me as an admin. So this is why I'm currently the only one. We can also see permissions. Okay, what kind of permissions does this application have over my tenant? Like I said, when you provide admin consent, every user in your organization is going to be able to use this application. In this case, this is a low-risk application, but in some cases, I can believe that organization wants to limit who can log into this application. So this is done through user assignment. If we click on properties of an enterprise application, we can actually select user assignment required. If we put this to yes and click save, what will happen then? Only users who are in this list will be able to log in. I will try to show you this again with my user. So let's try to log into the application and fill in the password. So this user should receive a pop-up or a notification that he cannot log in. But do know, while this is an awesome feature to limit which users can use in applications, not all applications handle the error codes from Azure AD well, and the user could receive a pretty benign message. So if we look here, you can see here, okay, the connection is denied. So this is a pretty lame message from Calendly, which I know happens with this application. But this also shows you, okay, while the application is in our tenant, it has been approved, this user cannot log in unless he's added here in the users and groups. So now we have reviewed 4 kind of mitigations. We have publisher verification, which is the job for an application builder. Then we have consent policies. Okay, can a user add applications? And if so, what permissions? We can configure the admin consent workflow, which makes it easy for an end user and administrator to request applications. And then we have user assignments. If a user has added, if an application has been added, you can limit which users have access to these applications. Now, while these are some awesome features to defend your organization, it's important to also monitor enterprise applications. So this is actually done, you can do it through two ways. You can do it through CloudApp Security and through Azure Sentinel. Let's start off with CloudApp Security. I will go immediately to the portal, which will be the easiest to show you. If I go to portal.cloudappsecurity.com, we will be able to manage our enterprise applications right here. So by default, the enterprise from Azure AD are not synced to CloudApp Security. We have to enable this first. If we go to settings and then app connectors, we can actually select Office 365. If we click here, edit settings, you have to make sure Azure AD apps has been enabled. If you have enabled this and given the sync some time, you can go to investigate and then OAuth applications. Here you can see in OAuth applications, you will see every enterprise application which is in your organization. Know that there is, of course, a sync between Azure CloudApp Security, which can take a while. So normally the currently app, as you can see, will not be here. But right now, we are greeted with an awesome overview. So this is the overview you see for enterprise applications within CloudApp Security. If we go back to the Azure portal, this is the one we see. As you can see, the only thing you can see here in one blink of an eye is the name of an application. What can we see here in CloudApp Security? Okay, we can see the name of the application, but we can see which users are using this application. In my instance, this is only me as an administrator. We can see, okay, which is the permission level. This is calculated by Microsoft and says, okay, this application has a lot of permissions or doesn't have a lot of permissions. So this makes it really easy to review your current applications. We can click on permissions and see, okay, these are the permissions this application has. This is something I advise you to do too. After you have disabled consent, it's important to run through the current applications within your environment and to check, okay, which one might be malicious and would I not want to keep. This is also something that you can use these buttons here. We have two actions. We have the mark as approved action and the banned action. Mark as approved is just a visual indication which will approve the application. In the background, nothing will happen per se. What will happen with mark as banned? Well, the enterprise application will actually be banned in Azure AD, and the user will not be able to log into this anymore. Let me show you this with an example. We will take the MDATP tags enterprise application. If we search for this in Azure AD, we will see in properties, right now enabled for user sign-in is set to yes. If we go back to CloudApp Security, we can choose to ban this application. So this will say, okay, it will disable this application in Office 365. You can, if you want, send an automated message to the end user that this application has been banned. If we click ban application, in the background, this will go to Azure AD and block the application. This thing can take a minute or two, but after this is done, we can check the result. One thing I want you to do here is make sure that you use the approved and ban options, because then you have a visual way of knowing, okay, an administrator has already checked this application and it's good to go, which makes it really easy for teamwork. So as you saw maybe in the left bottom, the application has been banned. If we go back here and refresh, we'll have to go out of this and make sure it isn't cached anymore. You can see enabled for users to sign in is no. This makes it a really handy feature to manage your applications from CloudApp Security, and it will sync back to Azure AD. CloudApp Security is just easier to use to manage your applications and view what applications you have, because you can also filter on an application that has certain permissions, etc. Now, this is the review part. We can see, okay, which applications have been added. We can also monitor with Cloud App Security. This is done through control and then policies. When we go to type, we have two different OAuth options. The anomaly detection policy are actually default rules by Microsoft who are enabled by default, who will check for some kind of OAuth malicious consent, like an OAuth phishing attack. It will use all the information that Microsoft has gathered and throw an alert when a suspicious application has been added. So these are really awesome. But if you want, you can also create a policy and create a new OAuth app policy. You can name this new app policy. And in this, you have a few filters, which means you can decide when an alert should be thrown. You might want to check, okay, I want to receive an alert when the permission level is high. This is the policy I recommend. Even if you have disabled consent, you might have an administrator, like I'm not a fan of developers, like a rogue developer, who is just adding every possible permission to an application. With this, you will be notified if an application has too much permissions than needed. We can create an alert. We can also send a mail notification to an administrator. And what is really awesome, we can also revoke an application by default, which means here we can really filter granularly, okay, which application should be revoked. The added value above the consent policies is that you can here go really granular and choose, okay, I'm quite going to allow all applications except these with those permissions, which can be awesome to do. I have already created a policy like this. If we go to alerts and leave page, we can see here, okay, new app created, and we can see what kind of applications have been created. And here we see the same overview as in the OAuth apps overview, and we can immediately block or approve this application. So this was Cloud App Security. Cloud App Security is really good at reviewing your current applications, but can also throw alerts to make sure you're notified if an application has been added. This is both to defend against inside threat and external threat. Then we have Azure Sentinel. Azure Sentinel is the SIM and SOAR product from Microsoft, which can be used to combine your logging data and then create alerts when malicious activities has been found. You can go to Azure Sentinel from the Azure AD portal, and here we will be able to see a few things. When you want to create a new rule inside of Azure Sentinel, you have to create an analytics rule, like here. And then in rule templates, these are templates by Microsoft, which you can enable, but aren't enabled by default. If we search for consent right here, we can see some rules that you can enable to monitor consent. For example, this rare application one will monitor, okay, I want to know which application hasn't been consented to in the last 14 days, which could mean you can check for red applications which haven't been used often. You might ask yourself, okay, I can create policies inside of Cloud App Security to notify me of new applications, but also in Azure Sentinel. Which ones should I use? Well, for most of my customers, I advise them to use Azure Sentinel because they're putting all of their rules there. And then you have one central place to manage your alerts. And then you can create playbooks, which are logic apps. And these are automated actions you can do. For example, if a red application consent alert comes in, you could start a playbook, a logic app, which goes out to the user, to Teams, and asks them a question about some justification. And then this justification can be added to the incident. So this is, again, to monitor new applications who have been added. Inside of Azure Sentinel, we also have workbooks. Workbooks are actually a way to visualize the information of the logs. And templates, again, these are available in every Microsoft tenant. We can go to Azure AD audit logs. And if you view the template, we can go back to the category and choose application management. And here you can see every action that has been done regarding application management or enterprise applications. Like I said before, here we can see service principal. Service principal is the same as enterprise applications. They're used next to each other. But this is a really easy visual way to check, okay, what are the most actions done through service principals and who is doing this? For example, here, me as an administrator is doing a lot of these things. But if you would see a really active user here, you might want to ask this user, okay, what are you doing and do you know what you're doing? So you can educate the user also on what are enterprise applications. So with Azure Sentinel, we can do two things. We can visualize the information that we see in the audit logs, and we can also throw alerts to review new applications. So this is what we can do to monitor. We can use Cloud App Security to review the current permissions, which I advise, and then Sentinel to create alerts when certain applications have been added. Now we have seen what are enterprise applications, what is the danger, how can we defend ourselves, and how we can monitor. Before I end the session and start answering questions, I want you to get a few key points to take home with. The first one is to disable user consent and only allow user consent for verified publishers and low-risk permissions. This way, you are safe and you will not be affected by OAuth phishing attacks. You might not have seen an OAuth phishing attacks yet, but they are really prevalent and are being created more and more. So really watch out for this. After you have disabled user consent, I advise you to review your current enterprise applications. Review them and check, okay, is this one legitimate? Might they have already been phished? Or is an administrator giving too much permission to an application? So this is done through Cloud App Security. Then the third one is really important, in my opinion, is to educate your administrators, but also your developers to know, okay, what is an enterprise application? How should I manage it? And how do I make sure I use a least privileged permissions? Then when you have all done those things, which doesn't take a lot of time, as I think you can do all of these things in an hour, but you have to decide with management what you want to do. And the last thing is to monitor for new applications, know what applications are being added within your organization, and know what is happening with enterprise applications. So my session is now coming to an end. I'm wondering, Kenneth or Peter, are there any questions in the chat?
There are a couple of questions.
I see a question from Khalid. Will the permissions also limit the visibility and M365 app portal for the end users? Could you explain this more, Khalid? I'm not sure what you mean by this. Do you mean that's in the... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Thijs. You were talking about enterprise applications, the permissions that you can enable in the properties section. And my question for that is, will that has it also affected the visibility for the user when it logs on into his Microsoft 365 app portal?
It depends. It's a different setting, actually. Let me show you. If you go to enterprise applications, and for example, currently, if you go to properties, you can select visible to user. If this is clicked yes, it will be shown. So it's possible you could block an application, but still be visible to the user.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Then Steve is asking about if we can send events to a third-party SIM. I assume, Steve, you're talking about the events for adding enterprise applications or service principals, which you can. They're not actually in the Graph Security API. They are in the Azure Activity audit logs. So you would have to read out this table and then push it through a third-party SIM. In your case, it might be easier to create the policies in Cloud App Security and just ingest the alerts that are being created by those policies. And then Steve is talking about reviewing apps can be really a cumbersome task. And it's true. And large organizations, you will see a lot of applications, a lot. It's sometimes just, it can seem feasible how many they are. But this is, of course, where the power, again, of cloud app security comes in. And you can review the permissions through certain filters. So it might be easy to filter on high-level permissions first, do these first, these are the high-priority ones, and then later check the other ones. Okay, I think this is the last of the questions.
Are there any more questions? No, let me quickly share my screen. So
thank you guys for the attention. Feel free to always contact me through social media if you have a question in the future about managing enterprise applications. I'm happy to help.
Yeah, your contact details are in the slide deck, which we will share via the newsletter. So thank you very much, Thijs.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your taking out your time out of your daily schedule. We talk soon because we have a new book to deliver, a new version again. But yeah, thanks for now, and thank you for our sponsors, and thank you all for joining today. Hope to see you in 2 weeks after a week of holiday, and then Eric and Kenneth will be our presenters. So thanks again, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
All right, bye all. Thanks, Thijs.